NPA Viewpoint for this week. Today's topic has the crazy title, The Madness of Interest-Only Loans. Some people believe interest-only loans are indeed mad. So let's have a look at some of those issues today and have a look at some of the determinations which dictate that interest-only has a part to play when building an investment property portfolio. Effectively, a lot of conjecture, a lot of speculation in the press and the media at the moment about the Australian housing market, and there is a lot of talk about interest-only loans. Up until recently, there was up to 43% of all loans written were interest-only. Latest data coming through suggests about 36%. So effectively still a major number of 36% of all loans written in Australia at the moment are effectively interest-only. Does interest-only have a place? Well, yes it does, and we'll talk you through some of the rationale, some of the mathematics and some of the logic behind that when we get to the whiteboard in a second. But it's just some of the safety nets regarding interest-only loans as well. Probably three determining safety nets. What we're finding based on our anecdotal evidence around the country and our data based on our NPA affiliated mortgage broking contingent, three considerations. Number one, in most cases, in reports we're getting through with the data, in 95 to 98% of cases, anyone that has an interest-only loan also has debt reduction of some magnitude on another property in their portfolio. So we're still looking at debt reduction even though an interest-only loan is in place, but it just happens to be another property in the portfolio. So that's point number one. Point number two, there generally seems to be a correlation between interest-only loans and the wealth of a client. So when we look at that component, we look at affordability, we look at the fact that the wealth of that client is a determining factor with the interest-only loan. So a bit of a safeguard there in a lot of cases. Number three is in most cases interest-only loans are at an 80% LVR, 80% of the mortgage, so there's a 20% security net there as well. So I guess with that in place, it becomes a really critical part of the equation to suggest interest-only loans are really there in our landscape, and once again we'll get to that particular point with the mathematics and the logic involved, but there's a safety net component and there's a lot of logic-driven lending in Australian lending practices at the moment. So let's, without further ado, go to the whiteboard for the next segment. Okay, let's look further at the so-called madness of interest-only loans, and let's develop some logic and some mathematics that dictate that interest-only has a part to play and is indeed a sensible option. I guess first and foremost, let's look at conventional wisdom. Conventional wisdom dictates that principal interest is smart. It's an obvious thing to put principal into a loan in order for that loan to be reduced. The conventional wisdom at play is that by paying the principal, as is obvious, the loan will come down and we'll own that property outright at a set point in time, as opposed to interest only. Now, conventional wisdom dictates that why on earth would anyone pay interest only on a loan and flatline that particular loan over a period of time, never actually paying off any principal? What would be the common sense in that? Well, in order to answer that, let's look at three defined bits of common sense in order to give you the answer to that. Number one, let's have a look at this example here where we have a $2,000 mortgage repayment. What I'm going to do is look at the $2,000 repayment and I'm going to dissect it into two core components. The first component being $1,600 is the actual interest. So first and foremost, we have a $2,000 repayment, we have a $1,600 interest component, and we have $400 remaining, which is obviously the principal. Now, effectively, let's go to an interest-only option. In order to do that, we do not pay the $400, as is obvious. We only pay the $1,600. Now, the first of the three defined pieces of logic to dictate the merits of being interest only is purely from a cash flow perspective. Now, this has ramifications for both conservative investors and also aggressive investors. Let's have a look at that and see what I mean. So, we've eliminated the $400 principal portion. Our interest only payment is $1,600. Based on this hypothetical example, we now have $400 left over. Now, based on a conservative person, that $400 could be put in the top pocket, so to speak, family budget, and it's conserved cash flow. So from a cash flow perspective, the property is actually costing less to hold. So it has ramifications, obviously, which is the most obvious one, from a pure cash flow perspective. So in summary, option number one relates to the conservative investor from a cash flow perspective and purely comes under the banner of cash flow conservation. Cash flow conservation, effectively more money in the family budget, the property costs less to hold, and the ramifications that brings about. Let's go to number two. Number two is based on appropriate debt reduction. So let's have a look at this. This is an interesting topic. We look at the fact that we had a $2,000 repayment, $1,600 is interest, $400 is the principal. Remembering, we're getting rid of the $400 payment because we're going interest only. Now, does that then mean that we're not paying off any debt? Well, the answer essentially is no. Because let's have a look at it from a lateral perspective. If that $400 is still achievable to be paid from that particular client's cash flow, well, we can still look at debt reduction. But would it be logical when we look at two loans, we look at first of all the family home loan, which under taxation legislation in Australia is any loan attached to the purchase of a family home is non-tax effective, as opposed to an investment property where you have tax effective debt associated. So let's go back to that particular point. The $400 is not being paid off the investment property, because if the $400 was being paid off the investment property, our tax effective debt would be reduced. If we can still pay that $400, it can be used to help pay down the actual family home debt, the non-tax effective debt component, and it's $400 actually coming off the loan on that particular mortgage. Have a look at the logic from that perspective, and there's still, even though we're interest only, there's still $400 headway being made in terms of our debt reduction. But it's a smarter way to do it, because the $400 is coming off our non-tax effective debt on the family home, rather than sitting in and being paid off the investment property. So number two would come under the banner of correct debt reduction. That brings us to point number three. We look now at an aggressive investor. An aggressive investor may have the mindset that that $400 is being wasted somewhat in their mind because they can't access it in terms of their cash flow for other properties. So their reasoning would be, if I put that $400 into the debt on an existing property, it's $400 I don't have at my disposal to buy another property from a cash flow perspective. So the aggressive investor would look at this scenario a little bit differently. They'd say, let's pay the $1,600, let's be interest only, let's conserve this $400, and does that then open up more opportunities for enhancing the investment property portfolio, another property in another area, another set of capital growth considerations to look at. So once again, no definitive right or wrong to anything I'm talking about here in terms of the actual principle, only in the designated implications on a given situation. So it's relevant to someone's unique set of circumstances, where they are now and where they intend to go in terms of their journey with their property portfolio. So just in summary, number three is for the aggressive investor, and it comes under the banner of increased cash flow. And unlike the conservative investor, where the increased cash flow is for more money in the family budget and the property being more affordable, Even though the aggressive investor does have those advantages as well, it's probably more towards how can we further enhance the portfolio. So just in summary, we hear a lot of speculation, we hear a lot of people's thought processes on interest-only loans. Conventional wisdom dictates that you're never paying off your loan. By thinking laterally, we can negate that, because as we determined in number 2, if that extra money that's going to go into the investment property debt is still utilised to pay off debt, it still can be. And it can, generally in a lot of cases, a lot of investors will end up paying that off their family home debt instead of their investment property. So that negates that conventional wisdom that interest only is never paying off debt. It does, but from a lateral perspective. Number 2, more money in the family budget to bring down the cost of the property. Number 3, for the aggressive investor, more scope for increasing the portfolio. So I hope that gives you some great insights for this week. We look forward to next week and giving you some insights into another topic. Craig Whaley signing off for NPA Property Group this week. Thank you.